In this video, we'll review Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins. This is a picture of a suburban society during the post-World War II years, showing how prosperous Americans flocked to suburban housing developments, and the majority of Americans will be suburbanites by the end of the 20th century. This is also the end of an era, as victory in World War II restored confidence and prosperity to the United States, who had been demoralized by the Depression. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 struck fear into the American people and changed their mindset once again. We'll begin with Truman, who's the gutty man from Missouri. He was an accidental president, and Harry S. Truman presided over the initial post-war period. He was called the average man's average man. He was the first president in many years without a college education. He had farmed and served as an artillery officer in France during World War I and failed as a haberdasher. He moved into Missouri politics and rose from a judgeship to the U.S. Senate, and through the protege of the notorious political machine in Kansas City, he managed to keep his own hands clean. He started the presidency with humility, but gained confidence to the point of cockiness. He gathered old associates of the Missouri gang around him and was stubbornly loyal to them. He could be impulsive and stubborn. Cynics jibed, "To err is Truman." He did have down-home authenticity, and he had few pretensions and had rock-solid probity. A lot of old-fashioned character traits were called moxie, and people described him as such. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, this was the final fateful conference of the Big Three at the former Tsarist resort on the Black Sea. Stalin, Churchill, and the fast-failing Roosevelt had met. The momentous agreements and plans that took place were the final plans to smash the buckling German lines, the assigned occupation zones in Germany, and Stalin agreed that Poland, with revised boundaries, should have representative government based on free elections. This is a picture of the Big Three meeting at Yalta. You have Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Bulgaria and Romania were to have free elections as well, but this was another promise that would be flouted. The Big Three announced plans for fashioning the new international peacekeeping organization called the United Nations. There were controversial decisions to be made on the Far East. Lacking a tested atomic bomb, FDR wanted Russia to enter the Asian War to pin down the Japanese troops in Manchuria and Korea. This would lessen the U.S. losses if he had invaded Japan. Stalin agreed to do so 3 months after Germany was defeated, and in return FDR agreed for the USSR to receive the southern half of the Salkin Island and Japan's Kuril Island. Also, he would have control of the railroads and 2 key seaports in China's Manchuria. When it turned out that the USSR was not needed to defeat Japan, Roosevelt's critics charged him that he sold out Chiang Kai-shek down the river by conceding control of Manchuria to Stalin. And they also assailed the sellout of Poland and other Eastern European countries. Roosevelt's defenders said that Stalin, with his Red Army, could have taken more of China, so Yalta actually set limits on his ambitions. And at the time of Yalta, the Soviet troops occupied East Europe, and a war to eject them would have been unthinkable. The Big Three did not draft a comprehensive peace settlement. They sketched general intentions and tested one another's reactions. More specific understandings among wartime allies awaited the arrival of peace. There was little hope that the USA and the USSR could reach a cordial understanding on the post-war world. Communism and capitalism were historically hostile social philosophies towards each other. The USA did not officially recognize the USSR, the Soviet Union, until 1933. Soviet skepticism was nourished by long delays of American and the British to open the second front against Germany. Britain and America froze the Soviet ally out of the project to develop atomic weapons, which made Stalin unhappy, and Washington abruptly terminated the Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union in 1945, and then spurned the Soviet plea for reconstruction loans while approving a loan for England. They had different visions of the post-war world that separated them. Stalin aimed to guarantee the security of the Soviet Union. Twice in the 1900s, Russia had been attacked through Poland. So by maintaining the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, the Soviet Union could protect itself as well as consolidate a revolutionary base as the world's leading communist country. Many Americans saw this sphere of influence as an ill-gained empire. They doubted the Soviet goals were purely defensive, and the sphere of influence clashed with Roosevelt and Wilson's open world, which meant decolonized, demilitarized, and democratized, with strong international organizations for global peace. This went against the idea of self-determination for the countries that had been taken over by Hitler. This map shows the communist menace, first appearing in the New York Daily News on January 6, 1946. This reflects Americans' rising anxiety after World War II that the Soviet Union was expanding and gobbling up territory, imposing its will in both Europe and Asia. Both the Soviet Union and the United States were isolated from world affairs before World War II. The United States through choice, but the Soviet Union through rejection by other powers. Both had missionary diplomacy and were trying to export their political doctrines. Some confrontation was unavoidable between the communistic, despotic Russia and the capitalistic, democratic America. The Grand Alliance was only a child of necessity. In the progression of events, suspicion and rivalry grew because of misperceptions and genuine conflict of interest between the two superpowers. The Cold War would begin. This is a tense standoff that lasts 4.5 decades. It shaped Soviet-American relations and overshadowed the post-war international order in every corner of the globe. The United States erected structures for a more open world envisioned by Roosevelt. The 1941 Atlantic Charter had proclaimed the rights of self-determination, free trade, freedom from fear and want for all individuals. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the Western Allies had established an international monetary fund to encourage world trade by regulating currency exchange rates. Also, an international bank for reconstruction and development, called the World Bank, to aid economic growth in war-ravaged and underdeveloped areas. 3 years later, this began global reduction in trade barriers. The United States took a lead in creating these bodies and supplied much of their funding. The Soviets declined to participate. The UN conference opened on April 25, 1945, and Roosevelt shrewdly moved to establish a new international body before the war's conclusion. Meeting in San Francisco, representatives from 50 nations fashioned the United Nations Charter. The United States took the lead, but the Soviet Union did participate. The UN was the successor to the League of Nations, but it differed in many ways. The League adopted rules denying the veto to any party in a dispute. The UN provided that no member of the Security Council, dominated by the Big Five, which would be the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, could have action taken against it without its consent. The UN General Assembly could be controlled by smaller countries. So in contrast to the American reception of the League of Nations in 1919, the Senate approves the UN Charter on July 28, 1945 by a vote of 89 to 2. The UN headquarters would be in New York City, and it had some initial successes. It helped preserve peace in Iran, Kashmir, and other trouble spots, played a large role in creating the new Jewish state of Israel. The UN Trusteeship Council guided former colonies to independence. UNESCO, FAO, and WHO, the World Health Organization, brought benefits to peoples across the globe. The new atomic technology tested the spirit of cooperation, and the UN failed badly in this regard. The United States proposed a separate agency to have worldwide authority over atomic energy, weapons, and research. The Soviet Union responded with a call for the total outlawing of nuclear weapons by every nation, but the United States refused. The Soviet Union used the veto to scuttle the proposals in the UN, and the opportunity to tame the nuclear monster at this critical point was lost. The problem of Germany was the next issue on the table. Hitler's ruined Reich had created problems for all the wartime allies. They agreed that Nazism had to be cut out of German politics. This involved punishing the Nazi leaders for war crimes, so at the Nuremberg war crimes trials in 1945 to 1946, 22 culprits were tried. The accusations included crimes against the laws of war and humanity and aggression contrary to the solemn treaty pledges. The justice, Nuremberg style, was harsh. There were 12 accused Nazis that were executed. This is a picture showing the Nuremberg war crimes trial of 1946. 7 were sentenced to long jail terms. Foxy Hermann Goering escaped the hangman by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule and dying. Other trials continued for years. Critics condemned the trials as judicial lynching because the victims were tried for offenses that had not been clear-cut crimes when the war had begun. Beyond punishing the top Nazis, Allies could agree on little about the post-war Germany. Some American Hitler haters wanted to dismantle the German factories and reduce the country to a potato patch. Soviets, who were denied U.S. economic assistance, were determined to rebuild by extracting their reparation from the Germans. Both clashed with reality that the healthy German industrial economy would have been indispensable to the European recovery. Germany was divided into 4 military occupation zones. Each one was assigned to one of the big 4 powers: France, Great Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. The Western Allies refused to allow Moscow to bleed their zones of the reparations, and the ones that Stalin had insisted that he had been promised at Yalta, and they began to promote the idea of a reunited Germany. This is a map showing the post-war partition of Germany. You can clearly see that the Soviet Union took over the blue part of East Germany here. The French took the greenish part of Germany, which was here. The United States took this purple section, and the British occupation zone was this orange section. And so Germany was divided. And this joint occupation under the 4-power occupation lasts from 1945 to 1990 and becomes basically a symbol of the Cold War tensions. Communists responded by tightening their grip on the Eastern Zone. It soon became apparent that Germany would remain divided. West Germany became an independent country which was wedded to the West. East Germany, along with other Soviet-dominated Eastern European countries, became a nominally independent satellite state bound to the Soviet Union. The Eastern Europe virtually disappeared from Western sight behind what was called the Iron Curtain of secrecy and isolation. The division of Europe would last for 4 decades. What about Berlin? Berlin was deep within the Soviet zone, divided into sectors that were occupied by troops of each of the 4 victorious powers. In 1948, after controversies over German currency reform and the 4-power control, the Soviets abruptly closed the rail and highway access to Berlin. Berlin was a huge symbolic issue for both sides. Americans organized the gigantic Berlin airlift as a result, and U.S. pilots ferried thousands of tons of supplies a day to the grateful Berliners. Western Europe took heart from the demonstrated American commitment in Europe. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May of 1949. In the same year, 2 Germanys, East and West, were established, and the Cold War congealed. This is a picture of Berlin in 1948, watching a U.S. airplane drop much-needed supplies from the Berlin airlift.